Howdy, y'all, and welcome back to another episode of Future Sight, which is, of course, a soundproof podcast production. We're here, well, not live, but pre-recorded from the Soundproof Podcast studios. Of course, my name is Brendan. I'm joined by Jake. You know our tags by now if you're watching this video. And we're here with, as promised, the thrilling follow-up to our last episode.
Yeah, we did the top 8, I believe, between Gabriel and Paul Ruiz at EUIC a few weeks ago. And now we get the finals between Gabriel and Paul Chua. Again, we covered Gabriel last time. He's a phenomenal player, regional champion, prior IC runner-up, and then Paul Chua is second most regional wins of all time. Also a prior IC runner-up, top 8, maybe it's 8 or 4 top 8 or top 4 worlds last year.
Paul,
was one of those,
I think
yeah.
top 4.
Okay, that sounds right.
Yeah, I think top 4.
Yeah, so I mean, both phenomenal players, and both running similar talents, as people call them, teams.
Talents, yeah.
So it's a really interesting match just because these two players are very good at positioning, and so seeing how they maneuver the same team was really cool.
Yeah, so I mean, both of these players, their names basically precede them at this point. They're two of the best players of all time. I don't think that's really up for debate. And the last time Paul was in it, were you there at when his IC final appearance?
In 17?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was, I have a really fond memory of watching that because we were all sitting, he got to Blizzard 3 times in the end game of game 3, and we were like, okay, everybody knows Paul, he's going to get a freeze on at least one of these Blizzards, and he didn't.
Yeah.
He didn't, so he's seeking revenge in some respect, I suppose, and trying to get his first international title. So as Jake mentioned, both of these players are kind of running their take on what is called the balance team or Palafin balance team, and you can kind of see the little differences and also the similarities, which I think are also important to point out. But the most important difference in this matchup here is, of course, the Baxcalibur.
The Baxcalibur, I think, is actually a really cool part of this team for Gabriel. Just looking at Paul's team, Bax does really well into Palafin. You can't burn it with Arcanine, especially with the Clear Amulet. You can't intimidate it, so that's good. Poison Terra Bax is really good into Flutter Mane. You have Ice to threaten the Tinglu and the Amoonguss. So I like that a lot. I think that it's kind of cool, too, that of the 5 Pokemon that they share, 4 of them have some kind of difference. The only ones that are identical, the Flutter Manes, are both Choice Specs with Thunderbolt coverage move and Terra Fairy. But the Palafin on Gabriel's end is Substitute over Haze, which is cool. Gabriel's Arcanine has Howl and is Terra Flying, as opposed to Terra Grass and Extreme Speed for Paul. Gabriel has Clear Smog Amoonguss, I believe, and Paul just has Protect. And then Gabriel has Stone Edge, Tinglu, and Paul has Sand Tomb in the kind of the fissure slot. So yeah, some really neat differences. I don't think the Moon gets brought, as it shouldn't, in this matchup, if you ask me, but the rest I think are all pretty good options.
Yeah, the Moon is for other things. Obviously, you play the Mirror here a little bit different, but the other Dragon type on Gabriel's side, of course, is kind of known for being strong into the Palance core, so obviously it does come into this matchup here. I think that's all I have to say about the matchup. This is finals. It's very exciting, so keep that in mind when you see exciting things happen, that this is the final of an international championship. So let's jump into it here. So the Palafin Flutter Mane lead is what I would consider to be the go-to lead for these kinds of teams.
Yeah, especially if you're bringing Palafin. Palafin Flutter Mane is the more offensive option. Palafin Amoonguss or Palafin Arcanine is a very defensive option at the same time. So I think it's hard to go wrong with it.
Yeah, and we'll kind of see immediately how Baxcalibur kind of checks that lead pretty strong.
Yeah.
There's not really a whole lot that you can do to threaten it, especially when you still have 0 Palafin, as we can kind of see that a Specs Dazzling Gleam does effectively 0 damage to Baxcalibur, and it gets to retaliate with almost the entirety of bulky Flutter Mane's health.
Yeah, I mean, it is the entirety of it if you consider an Ice Shard. KOs it from there, too.
Right, yeah.
Clear Amulet is, really huge in this matchup, just because, obviously, you can't burn it because of the thermal exchange, and you can't be intimidated, so having that strong of a check to Arcanine is really, really good.
Yeah, and I think something to note for both of these past 2 turns is that even when Arcanine isn't, able to intimidate things, it's bulky enough that it still is, able to switch on a lot of different attacks because of how good of a defensive typing fire can be in this kind of metagame.
Yeah, for sure. And the Baxcalibur is still there. not really a great way to damage it. A Flare Blitz obviously wouldn't have KO'd it, and you can't really... you don't want to do that anyway, because you would have got knocked out by Glaive Rush, and now you have the option to like Ice Shard and prevent the like boosted damage, and this Excalibur just putting out a lot of pressure without really being threatened a lot itself in these first couple turns. Right,
and we talked about it last week too, is that Arcanine kind of puts a lot of pressure, you know, as like with Excalibur as its proxy basically, and,
right?
Like when you howl, you can't just kind of let Arcanine sit there and do 1 billion damage forever. But the Palafin switch here is a little bit telegraphed, which is why Gabriel's able to get Amoonguss onto the field at the same time.
Yeah, I like that switch a lot. Your Arcanine isn't really doing a whole lot there, other than, I don't know, eating a Flare Blitz on the switch. And so getting Amoonguss back in the field, especially at the same time as a Palafin coming in, means that you have the option to, you know, Pollen Puff if you want to, which is going to be really huge in this matchup. Or, of course, like check the Palafin really like a lot better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Fluttermane is going to kind of come back in here, and it's going to be really difficult over the rest of this match, at least, to kind of get Fluttermane into a position where it's actually going to be able to do damage, just basically because it has to switch into things like that, and then any time that Excalibur is on the field, it is threatened with an Ice Shard.
Yeah, and that was a really big Spore, too. That was a Goggles Arcanine in that slot. Mm-hmm. And he didn't even, like, Glaive Rush that slot, so it's not like he went for the double, like, covering a switch. Like, that was a big read. I think that was Gabriel, I think, was already pretty far ahead in this game, but I think that was a massive turn.
Yeah, and I think that it's kind of interesting, too, because Fissure Ting Lu is kind of, like, the biggest offender of this sort of phenomenon, I guess is a way of saying, is that there are a lot of positions in this format, especially between these two turns, where you're not really accomplishing a whole lot.
Right.
So that potentially the most effective thing that Amoonguss could have done that turn is fail a Spore into the Arcanine slot.
Yeah, good point.
So you're just kind of like trying to make some plays that sort of look a little bit strange to get yourself ahead.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you could just stalemate for the entire match.
Yeah, and this position is really, really nasty for Gabriel, because he can just sub, and Pollen Puff, for some reason, goes through Substitute, which is the most ridiculous thing. So you sub to block the Spore, and you also Pollen Puff your way all the way back up to full. Yeah, and now you have a Palafin that sub can't be broken.
The Palance mirror in a nutshell is Amoonguss and Palafin.
Well, I think sub gives you such an advantage in that mirror too, though, is the thing, because now the Amoonguss on Paul's end just like can't Spore.
Right.
at all.
And now you can just kind of like wave crash. Well, I mean, even if you start wave crashing, though, you can't really break through the Pollen Puff healing.
Well, yeah, I mean, it goes both ways, though, right? You just Pollen Puff each other until
the
cows come home.
Until the cows come home. But yeah, this is one of those sort of like stalemate positions. So you're like kind of just breaking even past the Pollen Puff damage, and then we see that a Pollen Puff does not even break this up.
No, which, spoilers, might be relevant later on in this match, but we'll get to that later.
Yeah. So a nice normal length wake there, like a pretty average sleep for Palafin, and it is after the Pollen Puff able to get the KO on the substitute.
Yeah.
But takes a wave crash for its trouble. So it took like three turns to break the Amoonguss Palafin position, but sub obviously the MVP there.
For sure.
Yeah. So now, like without Palafin, Paul basically doesn't have anything to do to Arcanine, and the opposing Palafin, I just like kind of runs through the team as well. So he's kind of on the back foot. These games seem to turn a lot based on who gets the first knockout. Like when you break through the defensive core, then it's a lot easier.
Especially when the knockout in this case is the Palafin. Mm-hmm. Like the Arcanine on Gabriel's end is sitting really pretty. So is the Palafin itself, like as long as you don't get Thunderbolted or something by the Fluttermane, which is still asleep. And especially with Arcanine coming in now, like I believe they're both goggles, so you can just kind of Flare Blitz either slot, and I don't know. It's going to be really difficult to break through really either of these two Pokemon on the field, especially considering the Pollen Puff Amoonguss is still in the back waiting.
Yeah, and it kind of seems like Paul is sort of like trying to find this position where at least something on the field is asleep, and then catching like a poor target so that he can get two Pollen Puffs onto a switching in Fluttermane, which is like a fringe win condition at best. Even for Paul, who's very good, it's like very hard to pull off because it relies on some misplay from Agati.
Yeah, that's exactly what he's going for here too. You see the swap back into Fluttermane and Pollen Puff, which I think is fair. Like I think the Fluttermane is your one big damage source that you have left, and so if you have ways to kind of sneak Pollen Puffs in on it, then I think it makes a lot of sense, especially considering that you're probably not going to be flare blitzing an Arcanine in that scenario. Like, you would never flare blitz that slot if you're a Gabriel. So provided Palafin stays asleep, this is a pretty safe play.
Yeah, and there it is. But the thing about that is a Howl kind of like sort of nullifies that sort of game plan. But he was able to get the 2 Pollen Puffs onto the Fluttermane, which was pretty good. And unfortunately, despite its title, it is not an early riser.
It is certainly not. I didn't even notice that. That's good.
I need to give all my Pokemon the tag early riser just to sort of manifest it.
Yeah.
But yeah, so now that Amoonguss is on the field here, Palafin doesn't even have to worry about taking attacks from the Fluttermane. So it's just kind of, it's at +1. It's going to take probably 3 Wave Crashes to knock out Amoonguss, although it does still have Citrus Berry, so I think it might
be
4,
neutral.
But yeah.
Arcanine came
it intimidated. Yeah, you're right.
Even then, like...
Yeah, so we're kind of at this sort of like slow point in the game where it's sort of kind of like a steady, like Paul has to really aggressively outplay Agati to really get back into this game. And even though he's able to get his Fluttermane up to full, and he's kind of been like burning a turn of sleep every time it comes in, eventually something like that is going to happen.
Yeah, I think if you're Paul and you're trying to make these big plays that kind of keep you in the game, like... Oh, that, yeah, he even spored the Amoonguss slot. Oh, wait, never mind. That was Gabriel's spore. But yeah, if you're trying to make these big plays that keep you in the game, like Gabriel trying to call that out once and succeeding just ends the game, I think. So at this point, yeah, I mean, Paul just lost in the forfeit.
Yeah, so he had kind of a fringe win condition.
Yeah.
And those are the kinds of win conditions that you can sometimes sneak through in like Swiss rounds
right.
when you're playing players that are not Agati, which is not to detract, obviously, from most of Paul's opponents, right. But it's a tough thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was just a really well played game by Gabriel too. The entire time, he felt like he knew like what needed to be on the field at what time.
Yeah,
and when he could afford to go for attacks, and when he needed to be more defensive with switches or subs or pollen puffs or something like that.
Yep, and I think it was pretty clear, kind of from the get go, what even though Baxcalibur only was on the field for like 3 turns, you can kind of tell like what it's doing here.
Yeah, for sure.
Speaking of which, Baxcalibur is back onto the field, and in game 2, you kind of see Paul is defaulting to this lead here, and I believe it's the same lead for Gabriel as well. Did he? Or no, he didn't lead Palafin in game 1, did he?
Yeah, he did.
He did? Okay, so both leads. Palafin, generally a Pokemon you want to lead anyway, except for some sort of like niche circumstances, because you want it to be a hero as soon as possible.
Pretty much. Yeah. What do you think? So I guess if you're Paul, what do you think you could do differently? Like,
well, I'm not really sure. I think that you kind of want to start throwing damage down onto Baxcalibur, but like Agati kind of always has the upper hand, right? Because like if you throw a Shadow Ball there, it's going to take it, and then if you don't get him, like if you don't force out the Terra on turn 1, then and you let Baxcalibur Ice Shard or Icicle Crash you for free, it's really hard to kind of like come back from that. The double target into Baxcalibur in that same sense is also a really hard play to make, because you could like Dazzling Gleam Wave Crash, and then if it Terras, you just like don't get a knockout. So there are like a couple combinations of targets that you could pull off into Baxcalibur if you really wanted to try that, but it's just like such a hard play to make. What would you do?
I'm not sure. Like, if this, because if you're either of these players, like the Palafins.
And Amoonguss can come into either slot
exactly, too. Yeah. Like, I guess Gabriel's Palafin is a little bit more set up to do damage than Paul's right now, just because the Fluttermane is going to take a lot more from Wave Crash than the Baxcalibur would, unless it Terras. Which I think is a very reasonable thing to expect. Like, I Terra'd immediately in game 1, and sitting in front of a Fluttermane, I think you kind of want the Bax to be poison, even if it like protects this turn and then swaps out, just so you have that swap into the fairy move. But at the same time, that's kind of a big risk. Like, a lot of the times if you're playing Palafin, you kind of have to manage, do I want to swap out and get hero form immediately, or do I want to risk taking a bunch of damage in exchange for throwing out a lot of damage at the same time? So, I don't know. I think the Fluttermane really can't lock into a fairy move, just because Amoonguss and Arcanine are probably in the back again, and the back's Terraing means that you're just doing 0 damage at all. But at the same time, like if you want to try and get more damage out with Gleam like you did in game 1, I thought the Gleam was fine, just because you got some chip damage off, like especially with Amoonguss coming in and your Arcanine being on the field, like that's Flare Blitz range probably. I don't know, it's rough.
It's tough to say. And one other thing that I'm thinking of, since you mentioned it, is that when you're trying to like kind of like decide when it's effective to make a damage trade.
Yeah.
It's hard to sort of like make those calls in the context of the entire game because of Pollen Puff.
Yeah, that's true.
So even if you're like, okay, nice, this was a cool trade for me, like I just want to throw damage out onto Baxcalibur, if you ever get caught like in a position where Amoonguss Baxcalibur is on the field and you're not threatening a knockout onto one of the two of them, then it doesn't matter that there's damage on it.
Good point.
All right, well, let's see what Paul does. He is just going to switch out. I think this was the play he made game 1 as well, right?
Yeah.
And depending on whether or not he goes for Shadow Ball or Dazzling Gleam.
Yeah, it was the swap. And then the swap to Amoonguss.
Yeah, it's the same play. Yeah. And it's the Terra again, so or at the same place. So whether or not Paul Dazzling Gleams again, I guess is going to be the only difference here.
I don't know. I respect that Terra regardless.
Yeah, it's safe.
Yeah.
And he does actually successfully get... So he was able to, like, I guess, triple the amount of damage, and then he gets the nice Icicle Crash Miss.
Really
so,
nice,
I mean, if you can sign up for an Icicle Crash Miss, I mean, you take that every single time. Because that did, like, over 75% to... even at -1 to the...
Well, it's Clear Amulet.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
To the Flutter Mane.
Yeah.
So now we're kind of back into the same position where there's basically just kind of like a set of safe plays you can make every single turn. Arcanine, the worst thing that can happen is it takes a Shadow Ball, but I think Paul correctly identifies that he needs to get damage onto Amoonguss.
That's a very convenient Shadow Ball roll.
It's a double target, yeah.
Yeah, well, that double target I think is pretty safe again, just because the backs... I don't know, I think if you're Gabriel, you know the backs is a really big piece, and letting it stay on the field and take an attack means it gets knocked out. That Shadow Ball roll, I don't know exactly what that roll usually is, but like doing barely under half is so big, because I don't think a -1 Flare Blitz would have knocked out like through the Citrus Berry, like he did just over half. So a couple lucky breaks there for Paul, but regardless, making the right plays every turn so far.
Yeah, I mean, and he has to. I think it seems to be as though he's on the back foot in this matchup just because of Baxcalibur pretty much always. So he kind of needs to be getting a little lucky and also one step ahead, like pretty much always. But Gabriel does get a free switch into Palafin, and this is kind of like its ideal position, right? Where Arcanine and Flutter Mane are on the field, and like those are two things that Palafin beats up on. Yeah, and I think the Amoonguss being gone for Gabriel is really, really big for Paul, just because any damage that happens now is going to stick. Sticks, yeah. Like the Shadow Ball damage on backs is really big now. Anything that the Palafin takes, whether that be like sub damage or like Shadow Balls or Flare Blizzes on swaps or anything. Now, like that issue where you have Amoonguss on the field not being threatened with a KO just doesn't exist anymore. So that makes lines a lot easier for Paul. Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And when you have this Flutter Mane's Festing on the field and it's pretty much always threatening big damage, that's really helpful. So here we go, damage that sticks. That's huge. Yeah. But Howl does go off, so this is going to be a pretty strong Palafin, and it's going to get the substitute off as well. So Gabriel, like, just because of the tools and Pokemon that he has available to him, is kind of like seeming to keep a foot in this game, but it's like still a really difficult position to come back from. Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of damage. I don't think Extreme Speed breaks the sub just because Palafin's very bulky. Unnecessarily thick. Yeah, it's not fair. Jet Punch there, I think it's fine. Like, the Flutter Mane kind of did its job. You got 2 really big Shadow Balls off, 3 really big Shadow Balls off, actually. And so you can let it go down. I think a +1, I guess a plus, that would be neutral though at that point. But you don't really want anything taking away Flash unless you have to. And you don't need the Flutter much anymore, especially because there's no, like, you don't need to Dazzling Gleam around Rage Spotters. You don't need to hit the backs with a Fairy move because it Terran. So it's a fair sacrifice. I think that's better than letting something else take like Jet Punch damage. Yeah, definitely. And this is kind of an interesting position where the speeds come into play big time. All these things are kind of sitting around the same place. So Paul Jet Punches into the wrong target and actually gives up a Wave Crash here, which I thought that he had like a whole bunch of ways of preventing that, but it does actually get a Jet Punch or a Wave Crash off, but we saw who was moving first, so he can just prevent another attack this turn with either an Extreme Speed or a Jet Punch. Yeah, I don't think that Wave Crash is a big deal, because I think it's... Well, it's not, It was just the one Howl, so it's neutral. And, I mean, even if the Arcanine goes down there, like, you still have the Amoonguss, the sub is broken, and you're in Jet Punch range or in Puff range. Like, there's so many different things that you can do to knock out that Palafin from there. Like, it's not really a big deal. And Paul actually goes for the offensive Terra here. I always forget what these calcs are, but I think that there are certain like -1 calcs where Arcanine can like take a jet punch if it's not.
Yeah.
So I always forget that. I have to look it up. So he goes for the Terra, and there's not really anything else that he'd need to be using it on anyway. No. And it's also going to help against this Excalibur.
Yeah, I mean, you still have the extreme speed to make sure that no jet punches come out and like snipe the Arcanine. Surely a Wave Crash KOs the backs, but even a jet punch may have because it's Terra.
Right.
So I think that was just a kind of an opposite example of game one where Paul had the upper hand like from the jump, especially with the like Shadow Ball targeting correctly. Rewarded with like the rolls and whatnot, but I think it's hard to say that Paul didn't deserve that game just because he was the one making the like more offensive plays and getting a lot of damage out when he needed to.
So the Icicle Crash miss definitely helped, but I think that Paul, I mean, that's not like an undeserved victory in any sense. Yeah. I agree with you. So yeah, we're kind of back here where we're going to basically be seeing the same turn 0, and we've kind of discussed sort of like some of the options that are available, and the one that we sort of touched on like a little bit is that you kind of have this like this like, this potential situation where you can double into Excalibur. That's kind of like sort of the remaining sort of like potential outcome of turn 1, right? Where
I guess that's like the one thing that hasn't happened so far. Right?
Yeah, so Paul, I think, correctly locked into Shadow Ball. Like in game 1, I don't know. I feel like I would always think about shadow balling there. Like I don't think that you really like Dazzling Gleam because it doesn't seem like there's any way that Gabriel isn't either switching one of Amogus or Arcanine into the Excalibur slot or going for a Terra. Like there's no real situation where Dazzling Gleam is like 1 out of 10 scenarios where Dazzling Gleam is doing more damage than Shadow Ball, right?
I think you can argue that Dazzling Gleam is fine provided you're switching to Arcanine like every time.
Okay.
Because like that little chip damage on Amogus means that Amogus is threatened with a KO immediately. And in that case, like, I mean, we saw him take the Icicle Crash for it, but at least that meant the Amogus was threatened by the Arcanine. And it didn't really just give Gabriel like a free position with that Amogus.
Right.
Otherwise, I agree though. I think Shadow Ball for the guaranteed damage, like nothing other than Tinglu resists Shadow Ball, and I don't think you ever bring Tinglu to this matchup.
No way.
And so that's pretty much guaranteed damage. Like if Moonblast is very risky because I think that's an even worse decision than Dazzling Gleam. And so I like the Shadow Ball play a lot, but I don't know. I don't know. Like same lead 3 times in a row, we're seeing Gabriel swap out the Palafin, but
and it's gone a little bit different every time. I think. Yeah. I kind of feel like. I don't know. Do you think that Paul still wins the game if he Shadow Balls turn 1 of game 2 and also takes the Icicle Crash?
I think he can. Yeah.
I think he can.
Well, yeah. Because what did that change? It meant that
it means that
Arcanine's Flare Blitz didn't knock it out.
Right.
Or the
back it's not in Jet Punch range. It's not in Jet Punch or Ice Shard range.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So it really changes the dynamic. And I'm not trying to take away from Paul because obviously he definitely can win, but I think it gives Agati an actual position in the game.
Yeah, I think that's a really hard hypothetical just because it was so early.
But I mean, I know it's a super hard hypothetical, but it's just something to think about whether or not Paul is like, okay, can I make the same play and have a similar outcome in game 2, or do I need to change what I'm doing?
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah.
I think that's certainly still a viable play. Especially you can. If you're shadow balling, I don't think you need to swap to Arcanine necessarily, so maybe that leaves you like with options to do something else with Palafin, or bring in the Amogus instead. I don't know, something like that. But yeah, I agree.
Okay. So anyway, let's see what Paul does. So Amogus comes in again. Wait, didn't Arcanine come in game 1? Or is Gabriel switching into Amogus on turn 1 every
I thought it was Arcanine.
Okay.
I don't remember. No, it was Amogus game 1.
And then Paul's been bringing Arcanine.
Yeah.
Okay. So obviously Paul is changing course here. There's going to be 2 Terras that go down, and this is like one of my favorite things about playing Palafin. We were playing Palafin before it was cool, right? Is that the little one kind of does a lot of damage when you're like not looking out for it. He gets a double Shadow Ball into Excalibur, and then Palafin, faster than Excalibur, actually gets it off. Huge play. Huge play.
The headphones pop off.
The headphones popped off for Paul, and you can kind of see Gabriel sort of like acknowledging, because he knows that that's a possibility, but it's just such a hard play to make.
Yeah.
Like it's such a hard play to make. because I don't know the damage roll, but it might be close. Like I don't like Terra Water, Wave Crash. Like Baby Paladin does not have a lot of stats, and then if at any point like it gave her, like it's just very easily punishable.
Yeah, no, I think given that the Shadow Ball and Wave Crash smacks anything that comes in there for a lot of damage, and especially given that Gabriel's terrored immediately and attacked immediately both times, I think that's really safe play with not a whole lot of downside. Okay, let's come back to this. I want to pause it right now. But I think that was just a smart play from Paul's end, because that's a lot of damage that you're probably getting off. Even if the Bax doesn't Terra,
that's the one thing, right? Is if the Bax doesn't Terra.
Yeah, but it's at like what, 25%
if
it doesn't Terra, because the Shadow Ball does the same and Wave Crash just does less. But
when you're at +0, you KO Miss Mages. Or Miss Mages, dude.
No, it's doing
Fluttermane.
It wasn't neutral.
Oh, that's right. It has clear. I keep forgetting. I keep thinking it was at -1. Okay, so it's never KOing.
Yeah,
I told you last week.
I know.
Last time I almost said Misfortune, dude.
I was calling it Mischievous a lot.
Misfortune. That's not even the same game. All right.
Yeah, so I think that was a safe play from Paul. What I don't think was a safe play was what he did this turn. I don't know why you ever bring the Arcanine on that slot.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that most telegraphed play there is Wave Crashing the Fluttermane, because it's, it can't protect, it KOs if it stays in, and that's kind of a big threat. Like the Fluttermane is a big damage source that can hit anything left with a Shadow Ball really hard, and that's kind of a careless swap, I think, from Paul. Like he had a really, really great turn 1, which put him very far ahead, and I think kind of immediately kind of tossed it back to Gabriel. Not that it's obviously unwinnable now, but I think it's much more neutral than it needed to be when Paul had such a good position. If you bring, let's say, like you just bring the Amoonguss in that slot, and then do whatever with the Palafin. You can bring in the Arcanine there if you want.
Yeah. I think you can correctly feel like after that turn 1 that the game's over, and Paul just kind of like decided that it wasn't.
Yeah, well, that's the thing too. Paul locks in his moves so fast. It's so quick every time.
Well, everybody has flowcharts for these kinds of matchups in there.
Sure, but it was immediate, Arcanine Fluttermane slot, easy to go.
Yeah.
And I don't.
Yeah, I think a Shadow Ball into either slot is a better play than that.
Yeah, it just seems like that wasn't the best option there. But I mean, now it's even, so
it's even.
It's a game again.
And we've kind of seen how impactful Amoonguss is here. Case in point, that turn where he gets a full damage wave crash or a full recoil wave crash, and then the damage that it takes from recoil is just completely gone.
Yeah.
And my point being that Arcanine is now gone, which is basically one of the more effective ways that you have of dealing with said Amoonguss. So it's going to be we're kind of into the position here where there's going to be a little bit of stalemating. They kind of have to grind out the damage. There's going to be an awful lot of sporing and things like that, where it felt like Paul sort of had a stranglehold on the game after turn 1.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the right play from Paul on this turn. The Protect Spore is a really easy play for Gabriel to make, and that was the worst case scenario, and all you did was lose 40% on Amoonguss. So now the Palafin is in a much better spot, because now you have the option to just sub. You can't be intimidated further. You still have your own Arcanine to howl, so this is a really strong position, because this sub is pretty much a guaranteed sub staying up on this turn.
Yeah, it's free.
I almost said Mr. Magius. The Fluttermane has to stay asleep.
Yeah, so the only thing that Amoonguss can really do here is Pollen Puff. Yeah, so just try and put damage down on the sub is basically the only thing that it can do here, knowing that it's coming.
Unfortunately.
And, as we know, the critical hit does matter.
Yeah, the Paul Chua special coming back.
You've heard of a Paul Chua fake out, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. The Paul Chua Pollen Puff?
The Paul Chua Pollen Puff. A Paul Chua fake out, by the way, is a Thunderbolt paralyze a 2-fold para.
Yeah, on the same time.
Just so everyone knows.
But that's also, again, just kind of unfortunate for Gabriel. That was a really good sub.
Yeah.
And now that the Palafin's not behind a substitute, you open yourself up to an issue if the Fluttermane wakes up immediately, as it does. And so now you're taking a Shadow Ball for your trouble. I don't think you can substitute after that, because you're going to lose too much HP.
Just brutal.
And that is really, really rough. Yeah. Especially now, because you can't Rage Powder and also Pollen Puff at the same time.
Yeah.
If you're not Rage Powdering, either Palafin gets knocked out or Arcanine takes 1,000,000 damage. And if you are Rage Powdering, you probably still just Pollen Puff the Palafin slot if you're Paul.
Right.
For that damage to get another knockout. So I don't know. really, really rough spot because of the Pollen Puff crit and first turn wake. Like that combination of those two things.
Yeah.
And possibly even a damage roll on the Shadow Ball, because that looked like it was really, really close to like a quarter HP.
Yeah, that's what I was going to point out as well. So potentially all three of the things Paul needing to like go right for him happening on the same turn. And it basically just sort of like reverses the entire position.
Yeah, but unfortunate.
A bit unfortunate, but we've still got more sleep turns to deal with here. As Amoonguss is basically like unchecked, it would take 4. It's probably a 4-hit KO with Citrus Berry to knock it out with Shadow Ball. It's gone.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It took it on the switch.
Oh, that's right. That's
the spore.
Right. Yeah. So it's a 3-hit KO from here. Oh no, it's a 2-hit KO. Yeah. Okay, that does more damage. Oh no, because it's a roll. That's right. It's a roll. It's the roll. That's right. We saw that. We saw that in game 1. So that it's either a 2-hit or a 3-hit KO, depending on whether or not Paul gets the rolls. Which at this point you feel like he probably does. But Amoonguss is still able to kind of get these sleep turns down, and then this is kind of like, at least to me, one of the hallmarks of this sort of team is that you get these positions where.
First turn wake again.
If Paul gets another first turn wake. You can kind of get into these positions where, like, if you get a 2-turn sleep, you're just like golden. Like if you get a 2-turn sleep and you pin the one slot, like with their pin or like sleep the one slot, and you get the opportunity to like Pollen Puff on the switch or like get chip damage down. But if there's a 1-turn wake, then it kind of reverses everything.
It's unfortunate too, because a lot of time that is just the best option. Like, relying on not getting a 1-turn sleep isn't
it's like high odds.
Optimal, but it is still high odds. It's 2/3, and so it feels like the right play at the time, and it might just be the right play objectively in retrospect too. But you just sometimes get unlucky, and that's how it goes. I think
sometimes get unlucky.
I don't know, and like because the start of that third game was so good for Paul, and then he just kind of tossed it with that Arcanine swap. I think if you don't do that, it's really, really hard to lose that game. But after you lose that Arcanine, Gabriel's all of a sudden in like a way better spot than Paul is, just because the Arcanine's kind of a big deal for Paul to like mitigate the like Amoonguss.
Yeah.
Especially because it can't Terra, because the Vax has been all 3 games. But Paul, I don't think like, I don't know. It's hard to say that Gabriel definitely wins that. Had the Pollen Puff not correct, or had the one of those not been a 1-turn sleep, but
as we said, it's hard to do those hypotheticals.
Yeah, but it feels like Gabriel just didn't really get the chance to play the game after the second turn.
Yeah, it was just kind of like, and you see sometimes people that like go online and like calculate their end game. Like, like with all of these things happening, I had X% chance to lose the game, and with all those things, like small percentage chance things that happened, it kind of feels like the game's a lot different if like even any one of them doesn't happen. Like one of them is a 2-turn sleep,
right?
Or you manage to get the sub up and prevent the spore. Like any one of those things definitely change. You know, we can't predict whether or not it changes the outcome for sure.
Yeah, as
we've discussed, hypotheticals are a little difficult, but it definitely changes. I don't know, the texture of the game.
Oh, I like that.
The texture of the game. Yeah. So Paul obviously goes on to win the international championship. He has a strong case for being in, you know, one of the top 10 or 5 players of all time at this point, given that he is the second most winningest regional champion of all time.
Only taken over this year too.
Right, yeah, he was kind of like jockeying with Wolf for a while, where like Wolf will win one and then Paul will win one, and then Wolf is up 2 or 1 at this point, right?
I think it's 7-6. Yeah.
And of course they both have an international championship. Anyway, we don't have to talk about that. We should just do a whole cast on like the best 10 players of all time. I feel
that'd
like
be fun. Actually,
we bring that up all the time.
Yeah.
So yeah, huge congratulations to Paul. Personally, it's always like Paul used to come to my locals and just farm me. Like I think it was like years before, like back when we were playing Best of 1 Swiss. Like I don't think I even took a mon off of him until like 2017 or something like that. It was just ridiculous, and he'll talk about it too, about how he gets his Connecticut buff and just like comes up to Connecticut and just wins. we were like doing cash prize PCs, so he's talking about just like taking money from us in Connecticut.
That's funny.
So it's always funny. Like I always appreciate seeing Paul do well, because it's not like I'm just getting farmed by a random. I'm getting farmed by one of the better players of all time.
That's great.
Anyway, we've got some more events coming up, so we will move on from the Europe International Championships in 2 weeks.
We got Portland this coming weekend. We got Hartford 2 weeks after that, I think.
Yeah, so we'll have a whole host of new content. I know Paul will almost definitely be at Hartford, and if he does get his Connecticut buff, he may pull into a tie with Wolf, so there you go. So look forward to that. Of course, we'll have some new stuff for you guys. Been trying to pull some interesting matches Hopefully there will be some like interesting things that show up at some of these events, because it does sort of look like the format is like almost, I don't want to say solved, but it's definitely sort of like stalling out a little bit around these kinds of balanced teams, although we have Earthworm as a hope. Some of those sort of like counter meta things, so hopefully some cool things will pop up so that we can show some exciting matches with, you know, non 5-mon mirrors. And hopefully you'll be there to join us in 2 weeks. Until then, find us on socials, in the comments of this video. We look forward to hearing all of y'all's feedback, and until next time, be good.
Wise words.